Most vegetables you plant this July will be dead by October. Frost will take them, you'll till them under, and next spring you'll be back on your knees, planting the exact same seeds all over again. But there's a small group of plants that don't play by that rule. Plant them once this month, and they'll push back up out of the soil every single spring for the next 5, 10, even 20 years, asking for almost nothing in return. Today we're looking at 15 of them. Some you've probably never heard of. One of them might already be growing wild near your house right now, completely ignored. Let's get into it. 1. Asparagus. Asparagus has a reputation problem. Everyone knows it's a perennial, and everyone also knows the old rule that it takes 3 years before you can harvest a single spear. That's true, and it's also the reason most home gardeners skip right past it, which is a shame, because once an asparagus bed is established, it will happily keep producing for 20 to 30 years with almost no replanting, no digging, and very little fuss. July isn't the ideal asparagus planting month in most guides, but it's far from a dead end. What you're doing this month isn't sowing seed, it's establishing crowns, the root systems that will anchor the plant for decades. In warmer regions, a July planting gives the crown the entire back half of the growing season to settle in before winter dormancy, and by next spring, it's already ahead of a bed started from seed. Asparagus wants deep, well-drained soil and full sun, and it wants to be left alone. Dig a trench about a foot deep, mound the soil slightly in the bottom, spread the crown's roots out like a starfish, and backfill gradually as the shoots grow rather than all at once. That patience during planting pays off in root development that will outlast most fruit trees. The part almost nobody tells you. Asparagus is dioecious, meaning individual plants are either male or female. Female plants produce the red berries you sometimes see in late summer, and they put more energy into seed production and less into the spears you actually eat. If you're buying crowns, look for all-male hybrid varieties. They produce significantly more edible spears per plant because they're not spending energy on making berries. 2. Rhubarb. Rhubarb is one of the strangest plants in the vegetable garden because botanically most of what we eat from it isn't a vegetable stalk in the way we think of celery. It's a leaf petiole, the stem that connects the leaf blade to the rest of the plant. The leaf blade itself is genuinely toxic, loaded with oxalic acid concentrations high enough to cause kidney damage if eaten in quantity. That contrast, delicious stem, dangerous leaf, same plant, is part of why rhubarb has such deep folklore roots in cold climate cuisine. For centuries, it was one of the only tart, fruit-like flavors available in early summer in Northern Europe, before actual fruit ripened. Rhubarb crowns planted in July need a bit more care than a spring planting, mainly around water. The plant is pushing new root growth in warm soil, and it dries out faster than it would in cool spring conditions, so consistent moisture in the first 6 weeks matters more than usual. Once established, though, a single rhubarb crown can keep producing for 15 to 20 years, and it actually benefits from division every 4 or 5 years, which means one plant eventually becomes 3 or 4 for free. Give it rich, well-drained soil and partial shade in hot climates. Rhubarb is originally native to cooler regions of Asia, and it sulks in intense heat. If you're in a warmer zone, plant it somewhere that gets afternoon shade, and treat any harvest in the first full year as a bonus rather than an expectation. The plant needs that first season to build the root reserves it will draw on for every harvest after. 3. Jerusalem artichoke. If you want proof that perennial vegetables can be almost embarrassingly productive, grow a sunchoke. This is a native North American sunflower relative. Its cheerful yellow flowers give it away immediately, but underground it's producing knobby, potato-like tubers by the pound. A single planted tuber can multiply into several pounds of harvestable tubers by fall, and the plant is so vigorous that the real challenge isn't getting it to grow, it's stopping it from taking over. That aggressiveness is exactly why July is a fine time to plant it. Sunchokes are tolerant of being planted later in the season because they're racing against a long growing window anyway. They don't set their tubers until day length shortens in early autumn, so a July planting still gives them a full runway. The tubers have a nutty, slightly sweet flavor often compared to water chestnuts when raw, and they cook down into something closer to a earthy mashed potato. They also contain inulin, a type of fiber that many people's digestive systems aren't used to processing, so if you're trying sunchokes for the first time, start with a small portion. The plant's old nickname, fartichoke, exists for a reason, and it's more informative than most vegetable folklore. Plant it somewhere you don't mind it spreading, ideally with a physical barrier like a large buried container ring, because sunchokes left unchecked will colonize a garden bed within 2 or 3 seasons. 4. Perennial kale. Most kale is grown as an annual or biennial, harvested hard, and replanted every year. But there's a lesser-known lineage of kale collard hybrids, often called tree collard or walking collard, that behave completely differently. In mild winter climates, these plants develop thick, almost woody stems and can live and produce for 5 to 10 years, growing taller each season until they genuinely resemble a small shrub or tree, sometimes reaching 6 feet or more. They don't produce viable seed reliably, which sounds like a downside, but is actually the reason they've survived as a garden crop passed hand to hand for generations. They're propagated almost entirely from stem cuttings. If a gardening friend has a plant, a single foot-long stem cutting stuck in moist soil in July has an excellent chance of rooting before the season ends, giving you a genetic clone of a plant that might be decades old. The leaves have a milder, slightly sweeter flavor than standard curly kale, and because the plant keeps producing new growth continuously rather than following an annual bolt-to-seed cycle, you get a rolling harvest rather than one big cutting. In colder climates, it won't survive winter outdoors, but it can be grown as a large container plant and brought inside, or simply treated as a productive annual that happens to grow unusually large. 5. Egyptian walking onion. The Egyptian walking onion earns its name in a way that's genuinely strange to watch. Instead of flowering normally, it produces a cluster of small bulblets at the top of its stalk. As those bulblets grow heavier, the stalk eventually bends under the weight and topples over, planting the bulblets a foot or 2 away from the parent plant. Over several seasons, a single planting can walk several feet across a garden bed, which is where the name comes from. This is a true perennial allium, closely related to both onions and shallots, and every part of it is useful. The underground bulbs can be harvested like a small shallot. The green tops can be used exactly like scallions throughout the growing season, and the topset bulblets themselves can be eaten fresh, pickled, or replanted to start new colonies. July planting works well for the topset bulblets specifically. Press them into loose, well-drained soil about an inch deep, and they'll root before the weather turns. Because they're perennial and self-propagating, a modest planting this year can turn into a permanent, self-sustaining onion patch that requires no replanting ever again, just occasional harvesting and thinning. 6. Sorrel. Sorrel is one of those old-world plants that used to be a kitchen staple across Europe and has quietly slipped out of most modern gardens, even though it's easier to grow than almost anything else on this list. It's a low-growing perennial green with a sharp, distinctly lemony, almost tart flavor. The tartness comes from the same oxalic acid family found in rhubarb, though at a level that's perfectly fine in normal culinary quantities. French sorrel and garden sorrel are the 2 most common types, and both establish quickly from either seed or small nursery plants, tolerating July heat better than most leafy greens because of their deep taproot, which pulls moisture from well below the dry surface layer that stresses shallow-rooted lettuces. Once established, sorrel comes back reliably every spring for years, often among the very first greens to emerge, sometimes weeks before anything else in the garden even wakes up. Historically, sorrel's sourness made it valuable before lemons were widely available in colder parts of Europe. It was essentially the acid component in sauces and soups for people who had no citrus. That's still its best use today. A handful of chopped sorrel stirred into a cream sauce or a simple soup delivers a bright, tangy note without needing a single lemon. 7. Lovage. Lovage looks like a giant, overgrown celery plant, and the flavor comparison isn't far off either. It tastes like an intensely concentrated, almost yeasty version of celery, strong enough that a single leaf can flavor an entire pot of soup. It's a genuine perennial herb, native to the Mediterranean, and once established it can live for a decade or more, dying back to the ground each winter and returning reliably every spring, often growing 4 to 6 feet tall by midsummer. Because it's so aromatic, lovage has historically doubled as both a culinary herb and a folk remedy. Old European herbals mention it for digestive complaints, and the seeds were sometimes used similarly to celery. Seed as a spice. In the kitchen today, it's most useful as a celery substitute in stocks, soups, and stews, especially valuable for gardeners in climates where actual celery struggles. July planting from nursery starts works well, since lovage is tolerant of a wide range of soil conditions and isn't fussy about the exact timing, as long as it gets consistent moisture while its root system develops. Give it room. This is not a small herb, and expect it to become one of the largest, most architecturally striking plants in an herb garden within just a year or two. 8. Chives. Chives are probably the most familiar plant on this entire list, and also one of the most underrated, precisely because familiarity makes people overlook how genuinely low effort they are. A single clump of chives, planted once, will return every spring for well over a decade, slowly thickening into a larger and larger clump that can eventually be divided into several new plants for free. There are 2 main types worth knowing: common chives, with their mild onion flavor and pretty purple pom-pom flowers in late spring, and garlic chives, which have flatter leaves, a distinctly garlicky flavor, and white flowers later in the season. Growing both gives you 2 different flavor profiles from plants that take up almost no space. July is a perfectly fine time to plant chive divisions or nursery starts. They root quickly in warm soil and will have a full season to establish before winter dormancy. The flowers, worth mentioning specifically, are entirely edible and have a mild onion flavor, making them a favorite for scattering over salads or deviled eggs for both flavor and color. Once you have an established clump, you genuinely never need to buy chives again. 9. Horseradish. Horseradish is deceptive because the leafy top growth looks unremarkable, big, coarse, dock-like leaves that most people would walk past without a second glance. Underground, though, it's building a thick taproot that, once mature, delivers one of the sharpest, most sinus-clearing flavors in the entire plant kingdom, the same compound family responsible for the heat in mustard and wasabi. This is an extremely long-lived perennial. A horseradish planting can persist for 20, 30, even 50 years in the same spot if left alone, which is actually a common problem, because horseradish is notoriously difficult to remove once established. Any piece of root left in the soil after an attempted removal can regrow, which is exactly the trait that makes it such a reliable, low-maintenance crop if you actually want it there permanently. Plant root cuttings in July at a slight angle, about a foot apart, in soil that's been loosened deeply, since the root will grow straight down and thick roots need room. Harvest is typically in fall or after the first frost, when cold temperatures trigger the plant to convert starches into the pungent compounds that give horseradish its characteristic bite. A frost-harvested root is noticeably sharper than one dug in summer. 10. Good King Henry. Good King Henry is a plant that most modern gardeners have never encountered, despite the fact that it was a staple leafy green across medieval and early modern Europe, often filling the same role spinach fills today, before spinach became widely available. It's a member of the same botanical family as quinoa and beets, and the young leaves have a mild, spinach-like flavor that holds up well cooked or added to soups. The name itself is a small piece of folklore. Good King Henry likely distinguishes it from a poisonous unrelated plant nicknamed Bad Henry, an old naming convention used to help illiterate rural populations tell edible and toxic plants apart by name alone. It's a genuinely useful piece of history for a plant almost nobody grows anymore. As a true perennial, once established Good King Henry returns every spring for many years, tolerating partial shade better than most leafy vegetables, which makes it a useful filler for garden spots that don't get full sun. July planting from seed or starts works fine. Treat the first season as establishment. Harvest lightly if at all, and expect a much more vigorous, fuller harvest from year 2 onward. 11. Sea kale. Sea kale grows wild along coastal shorelines in parts of Europe, where its thick, waxy, blue-green leaves have adapted to tolerate salt spray, wind, and sandy, nutrient-poor soil, conditions that would kill most vegetables outright. That toughness translates directly into an extremely low-maintenance garden perennial, capable of living for well over a decade once its deep root system is established. Historically, coastal foragers in England and elsewhere would mound sand over the emerging shoots in spring specifically to blanch them white and tender, a technique similar to blanching celery, which produced a delicacy considered good enough to be served in fine London restaurants in the 18th and 19th centuries before it fell out of fashion. That's a striking history for a plant that today is almost unknown outside dedicated perennial vegetable circles. Sea kale prefers full sun and, unsurprisingly given its origins, extremely well-drained soil, heavy clay or waterlogged beds are the fastest way to kill it. July planting from root cuttings or nursery starts is fine, since sea kale isn't picky about exact timing, only about drainage. Give it its own dedicated space, since the leaves can spread 2 to 3 feet wide once mature. 12. Perennial wild arugula. Standard arugula is a fast annual, bolting to seed within weeks in summer heat. Wild arugula, sometimes sold as sylvetta, is a different species entirely, and a genuine short-lived perennial that can persist for several years in the right conditions, particularly in Mediterranean-style climates with mild winters. The leaves are smaller, more deeply lobed, and noticeably more peppery and mustard-forward than standard arugula, closer to what you'd find in a high-end Italian restaurant salad than what's typically sold in a grocery bag. Because it's more heat-tolerant than annual arugula and less prone to immediate bolting, July planting works better for wild arugula than it would for its annual cousin. Hot weather that would send regular arugula straight to seed is something wild arugula handles with far more patience. Once established, it self-seeds readily in favorable conditions, which means a single successful planting can turn into a permanent, self-renewing patch even beyond its own individual lifespan. Its intense flavor makes it a garnish more than a base salad green. A small handful scattered over a finished pizza or pasta dish delivers a peppery punch that a full bowl of milder greens can't match. 13. Groundnut. This is likely the plant on this list you've never heard of, and it might be the most historically significant one here. Groundnut, or Apios americana, is a nitrogen-fixing perennial vine native to eastern North America that produces strings of underground tubers with a flavor often described as a cross between a potato and a chestnut, and a protein content dramatically higher than an actual potato, roughly triple, by some measurements. Indigenous peoples across eastern North America relied on groundnut as a staple food source for thousands of years before European contact, and there's a strong historical case that it helped sustain early European settlers, including the Pilgrims, through their first difficult winters, since it was one of the few reliably available wild carbohydrate sources in the region. Despite that deep history, it never made the jump into mainstream cultivated agriculture, and today it's grown almost exclusively by dedicated perennial food enthusiasts and a small number of researchers looking at it as an underused native crop. It grows as a climbing vine, so it needs a trellis or fence to scramble up, and it genuinely thrives in July planting since it's naturally suited to a long, warm growing season before tubers bulk up in autumn. Once established in the right spot, the tubers can persist and spread for years, essentially creating a permanent, low-maintenance protein-rich food source that almost nobody else growing food today even knows exists. 14. Strawberries. Strawberries are the most familiar perennial fruit most home gardeners will ever grow, and also one of the most consistently underestimated. A single well-cared-for strawberry planting can remain productive for 3 to 5 years before it needs renewal through runners, and because strawberries spread by sending out runner plants that root themselves nearby, one initial planting naturally expands into a much larger patch over just a couple of seasons, entirely on its own. There are 3 main types worth knowing, and choosing the right one matters more than most gardeners realize. June-bearing varieties produce one large concentrated harvest in early summer. Ever-bearing varieties produce 2 or 3 smaller flushes across the season, and day-neutral varieties produce a more continuous, steady trickle of berries from late spring through fall regardless of day length. For a July planting specifically, day-neutral varieties are usually the strongest choice, since they're not locked into a seasonal flowering trigger the way June-bearing types are, and they'll still produce a meaningful harvest in their first partial season. Give strawberries full sun and soil that drains well, since consistently wet crowns are the fastest root to rot. Mulching around the plants, straw is the traditional choice, which is actually where the plant's name may originate, keeps developing berries clean and off damp soil, reducing rot and slug damage significantly. 15. Wild blackberry. We're ending with the plant most likely already growing somewhere near your property completely uninvited, wild blackberry or bramble. In most temperate regions, blackberry canes are considered a nuisance weed, aggressival. Why colonizing fence lines, ditches, and forgotten corners of yards? And most people's only interaction with them is cutting them back or spraying them out. That's a genuine waste, because a managed blackberry planting is one of the most productive perennial fruit sources available, with individual canes living 2 years each, first-year canes called primicanes, second-year fruiting canes called floricans, but the root crown itself persisting and sending up new canes for 15 years or more. A properly trellised, thinned patch produces pounds of fruit annually with essentially no input beyond an annual pruning. If you already have wild brambles on your property, July is an ideal month to walk the property, identify a patch worth keeping, and start managing it properly rather than removing it. Thin, overcrowded canes. Install a simple wire trellis, and redirect the plant's energy toward fruit production instead of unchecked spread. If you're starting from nothing, thornless cultivated varieties planted from nursery stock this month will establish root systems well before winter and reward you with fruit as early as next summer. 15 plants, and not one of them needs to be replanted next spring. That's the entire point of a perennial garden. Every year you don't spend digging up dead annuals and starting over is a year you get to spend actually harvesting instead. Pick 2 or 3 from this list that fit your climate, get them in the ground this month, and next July, when everyone else is out buying seedlings again, you'll already be eating. If this helped, subscribe for more ways to grow food that keeps coming back. See you in the next one.